Hello and welcome to the Story Podcast. Today, with me on this podcast, I have Stephen Kiel. He made a huge, he have done an amazing job on making a huge supplement for 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. I won't tell you more because it's so goddamn awesome. Stay and listen. So today I am lucky to have Stephen Kiel with me, who is I was scouring through Reddit the other day, and then or was it a month ago really, and then I saw this post from this guy on Reddit, and he has made like a whole player's handbook and a monster manual for a Star Wars universe set in the D&D frame. I'm lucky to have him with me today. So how are you doing, Steve?
Good, yeah.
So you made this player's handbook for Star Wars in the D&D framework. So why did you do it?
So I'm a big Star Wars fan, and so I've been playing D&D. I got introduced to D&D 5 years ago at the tail end of, right before 5th edition came out, so I think 5 years ago. And played in a campaign, really liked it. Ended up DMing a campaign. I DM'd the starter set, the Lost Minds of Fandalvar, for a bunch of friends, and when we played through that, they all got really into it. They're all big Star Wars geeks too, so I was like, well, let's try doing this Star Wars instead of, traditional Forgotten Realms D&D. Mm-hmm. So I started writing it, and I wrote the first version of it, which was so bad. It was there were 4 classes. They had 2 archetypes. It was terrible. But we played through that for about 6 months, and then went back to a new D&D campaign after that one wrapped up. And then I just revisited this. I started revisiting it last September, and I've just been putting in 20 or 30 hours a week on it. And then I published a version in June. And now I'm here.
So 30 hours a week for 1 year.
Yeah, I mean it varied quite a bit. When I had motivation and I had inspiration, I guess is the proper word. When I had inspiration on something, I would fiend on it, and then as it would taper off, and then the next part would start.
I actually think we should go in a little bit into the player's handbook because it's very elaborate. There's a lot of races in it,
yep.
Right?
Correct.
So, why did you include all of these races?
So one of the first things I started when I revisited this is I got really into building the species for it. So I've actually since reskinned the races as species because it's more appropriate for the Star Wars mythos. And yeah, it made sense. So when I started getting back into this, September, October, I really I used predominantly what's called Detect Balance, which is this not engine, but framework, I guess, for designing and balancing your own races. And so I started using that, and as I started making, a few of the popular ones, like the obvious ones, like Wookiee, Zabrak, things like that.
I know Wookiee.
yeah, exactly. So I started building these species, and then I started playing around with the template that you can see in the book for the species 1 sheets, where it's all the information is on a single page, so you can just export that. And then I really enjoyed doing that as I streamlined the process. I got it how I wanted it to look, and then I just pumped out, however many races there were originally, 35, something like that. And that's pretty much where I started on this version of it.
So you actually began with the races, or the species.
Correct.
So where did you go from there?
So I started working. The hardest part of the book was the classes. So there are 10 classes in the player handbook. A few of them are direct ports of their 5e variants with a little bit of tweaking on my part. So the rogue got reskinned as an operative, the fighter is still the fighter, barbarian became berserker. So those were pretty easy to translate over and then just kind of cut out the spellcasting portions. And then the hardest part was obviously the engineer which is a tech casting class. It's a full caster, but it was kind of inspired by the Artificer, but it goes in a very different direction with it. And then the 3 force casting classes. Guardian is very heavily based on Paladin, but with quite a bit of tweaking on my end. And then Consular is built off of the Sorcerer. And then lastly, the Sentinel is kind of it's a 2/3 caster built off of a monk framework. That's the one that took the most work to kind of maintain balance and thematic approach. So those were the hardest parts. Those are the things I actually finished last.
So do you have like what's this called? Do you have like, is it optimal to play for 3 players together or 4 players?
So traditionally in D&D, in the 5th edition, I can't speak a lot to older editions. The encounter building from the perspective of a dungeon master, the ideal group size is 3 to 5 people. So I DM, like I'm DMing a campaign now, I DM to 4 people. And I think that's probably, I think 4 is a good balance, 5 is okay. Anything higher than that is too much because everybody needs to have an opportunity to shine when they're playing D&D. And if you have too many people, there's too much time where people can feel marginalized. So I think 3 to 5 is the perfect window, or perfect framework for group size.
Let's go a little bit back, because you said that you cut out all of the spells.
Yeah,
Obviously.
so, right. So when you look at a wizard from, Faerun, their spells don't really make sense. Most of their spells don't really make sense in the context of a Star Wars campaign. So this was also one of the biggest things I did. So I kind of flattened down spellcasting. I heavily adopted the spell points variant from the DMG, which if you're not familiar with that, instead of having a set number of slots per level as a caster, you have points that you accrue more over time, and you use those points to create slots, so you don't get stuck with level 1 spell slots that you can't really do a whole lot with at higher levels. So I'm a big fan of the spell point variant for this, so I appropriated that. I flattened it down to make it very simple on calculating how many points you have as a character of X level, and then I started porting spells and making them powers. And then the big distinction is that spells are separated into 2 categories: force powers and tech powers, and they are mutually exclusive. So while you could have both, you can't cast tech powers with your force points and vice versa.
That was one thing I actually was, I skimmed the handbook, because there's like, was there 289 pages?
Something like that.
It's a monumental work you have put into this. So I haven't got to the part where with the spells and all of that. What I'm trying to say is, I was quite curious about how you I was quite curious on where you was going to take this, instead of having spells, because you can't have some crazy D&D spells showing up in the middle of this universe. It just doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
But you said you were running a campaign in this.
Correct.
I'm also quite curious on how, like, say you have a 1st level character, and you have like a 20 level character. What is the main difference between these 2 dudes?
So a 1st level character is, of course, just starting out adventuring. If that person is playing a Jedi, they're like barely a Padawan at that point. They might be a bounty hunter. They're a fledgling. They're very much a novice. Whereas the 20th level characters are the end all be all. That's the aspiration of anybody to reach in their archetype. Like Luke Skywalker in Episode 8 is probably level 20. He's absurdly powerful. Same thing as like Yoda was probably level 20. So that's the kind of the range of, where like Luke Skywalker in Episode 4. Luke Skywalker in Episode 4 was probably level 1, maybe level 2. He was a farmer. He was a decent pilot, and he knew how to use a rifle, but, he was not exceptional.
So is the main focus to become a Jedi, or can you go a whole game and just be Han Solo?
So that's the whole point. The idea is that you can play anything you can think of that could exist in Star Wars. You know, Han Solo obviously is a huge iconic character. You could absolutely play as Han Solo if you wanted to. You know, Lando, you could play as Lando. You could play an entire campaign with no Force-sensitive characters at all, and it would just be, you know, your operatives, your scholars, you know, all these classes that don't use the Force. And you could do that absolutely.
So the idea is that you gain more power in the sense of weapons, or
so the you have to kind of accept there has to be a balance struck, and this is something that I toyed with and ultimately decided a level 1 Jedi and a level 1, let's say, operative have to be equivalent power level as far as progression to the game. But in the Star Wars, you know, in the movies and the shows, a Jedi is always going to trump another person at level 1. So like you have to keep the balance low, or you have to keep the balance as equal as you can at lower levels. You know, it's D&D. It's just like traditional 5th edition. The goal is to progress. You know, you progress the story, progress your character.
So the story in your campaign, where is that going?
So I draw a very heavy inspiration from the Star Wars Old Republic game, which, if you're not familiar, it's an MMORPG from BioWare that takes place at Star Wars in the Old Republic era, which is about 3,000 years before, you know, the events of Episode 4. So I really like that setting. In that setting, there are 2 major factions. There's the Galactic Republic, which is pretty similar to the Republic you're familiar with from the prequel trilogy, and then there's the Sith Empire, which is very similar to the Empire from Episodes 4, 5, and 6. So those 2 factions exist concurrently, and they're in kind of a Cold War stalemate with each other. So I really like that setting time period, additionally, because there are a lot of Force wielders. Instead of, you know, episodes, the prequel trilogy, there's a decent amount of Jedi, but there's only, 2 or 3 Sith at any given time. In the Old Republic era, you know, there are hundreds of both. So it allows, you know, a party composition. If they all want to play as Jedi and Sith, they can do that, and it makes sense.
Can there be a Sith and a Jedi on the same team?
Yes. Right now, the campaign I'm running, I have a Sith and a Jedi, and they are on the same team. They're not really aware of... We're only 4 or 5 sessions in, so they're not really aware of each other's motives yet. And then it's a bounty hunter and a soldier, a fighter. I'm sorry, not a fighter, a scout.
So, when a scout becomes level 20,
sure,
does he have like the same impact on the game as a level 20 Jedi or Sith?
If he is played correctly, he will have a strong impact on the game. It's really hard. Balance kind of goes out the window the higher level you get, because with full casters, which are the engineer and the Jedi consular, or just the consular, sorry, they get very powerful abilities that are limited use. So a scout can be powerful, but as far as, you know, a 1-round, you know, Nova, do as much as you can in 6 seconds, the Jedi consular is always going to win.
The way I found you was through a post on Reddit, and it has gotten an amazing response from the people on D&D Next, the subreddit. It was really fun to like look at all the comments just saying, okay, I am not a Jedi guy, but this is amazing work. And how do you feel about that response?
I mean, it's pretty cool. I'm more of a commenter, not really a submitter on Reddit. So in that post I'm actually looking at right now is the 4th highest rated post on D&D Next. That's really cool. You know, 120,000 people, yeah, saw the book I wrote. So it's pretty cool.
Not only did you write one book, you also made a monster manual for the game.
Correct.
Let me just see if I can find it. Does it use the same framework as the D&D monsters?
So all the monster stat blocks are identical. There are certain things that don't exist in traditional D&D. For instance, there's no piloting skill in 5e, there's no technology skill, there's no lore skill. So some of that stuff is re-flavored, but for the most part, if you know how to read a stat block for 5e, you could read all these. They're identical.
I can see you reworked also a little bit of the damage, because I'm looking at one. Let's just take the first page. This a monster called Adult. Oh, I can't pronounce that. Adult Acklay. Is that right?
Acklay, yep.
Acklay. It has kinetic damage.
Correct. So a bunch of this is covered in, I think, the third page of the player handbook. A bunch of the damages in Star Wars in traditional D&D, the basically bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage were consolidated into kinetic and energy damage. Those damage types are directly taken from... I drew inspiration predominantly from the Old Republic MMO and then the two Knights of the Old Republic games, and they use kinetic energy damage, so for easy sake of identification, I translated those accordingly. And then a few other damage types are adjusted. Thunder became sonic damage. Ion damage was implemented because that's really important for certain types. And I think that's the only really significant change for damage.
Can I play this game? Let's say I have seen the three newest movies, and I have played like few sessions of D&D, and then I find your book. Can I sit down and read your book through and play a game of Star Wars D&D?
Yep. So the idea is that somebody who is familiar with 5th edition, they read the player handbook, they understand the rules, they understand how it works, they could sit down, they'd have to pick out the book, they'd have to learn the new classes and species, but they could play the exact same game. They could absolutely, it does not take much if you already know how to play.
It's the same framework as D&D. So if you're familiar with D&D, a good guess will be you familiarize yourself with this as well.
Exactly right.
So where did this love for Star Wars begin?
I'm sorry?
Where did your love for Star Wars begin? Because you just don't sit down and write a book like this.
Yeah, so I'm 32. So I was born in the 80s. I grew up in the early 90s watching the Star Wars movies. The original trilogy, pretty much on repeat. Had all the toys. All the Star Wars crap when I was a kid. And I've always kind of been a fan. And then when Star Wars: The Old Republic, I think that was the big thing. When that came out in God, I think it's going to be 7 years in December. When that came out, that really revitalized my love of Star Wars because it's an incredible game. It's a lot of fun. Yeah.
How do you feel about the new movies then?
They are fine. They have. It's a pretty contentious topic. One of my favorite jokes about Star Wars fans is that you're not a real Star Wars fan unless you hate the movies.
Yeah.
So, they're both good. They both have their merits. They both have their setbacks. I'm interested to see what happens in Episode 9. I'll go there opening night. I've been opening night to every Star Wars movie, the last 4.
So the last movie is like the end of this the Skywalker era, right? Isn't it? Or am I wrong?
Kind of. So... Spoilers, guys. If you haven't seen The Last Jedi, it's been 9 months now. I don't really give a shit. So, Luke Skywalker dies at the end of the movie. I don't think he's going to be dead per se. I think he's going to reappear as a Force ghost in Episode 9. I think that's a pretty commonly held belief. And then, of course, Kylo Ren is technically half Skywalker because he's Leia's kid and Leia's a Skywalker. So I think that the whole idea is that the end of the 9th movie will tie up the Skywalker legacy and just kind of open up the universe for more opportunities. Like I know Rian Johnson, who did Episode 8, has his own trilogy that he's signed up for. So I'm really interested to see what he does with that, because it'll be his baby in its entirety.
So he has all his focus on that trilogy or what?
Right, and he's not picking up, J.J. Abrams did a great job with The Force Awakens, but if Rian Johnson starts and finishes his own trilogy, he'll have a more cohesive story, going over 3 movies, presumably.
And Rian Johnson did Rogue One.
No. Well, Rian Johnson.
I'm just messing this up. Sorry.
No, Rian Johnson did The Last Jedi. I can't think of the Rogue One director offhand. However, he did have Gareth Edwards. Gareth Edwards did Rogue One, and he did have a cameo in The Last Jedi. That was pretty funny.
I was thinking about one thing. I'm making some stuff for D&D 5e at the moment, and I want to ask you about because I'm making a thing called one shots for D&D. Is it possible to like do make some modules for your books? So, for example, you have Curse of Strahd and you have all the others for D&D. What will a module for your book look like?
I mean, that's a question for a more creative person than me. I'm really mechanics oriented.
Oh, okay.
As far as like I'm writing a campaign for my players and kind of evolving it as they go. But I have no intentions of writing out my own adventures. That's like a pretty daunting task to do. I know people have submitted on both Discord and both on subreddit, the r-sw5e. They've submitted their own adventures and one-shot things, and I'm actually playing in one that another guy wrote. That's been pretty fun.
Oh, that's very cool.
Yep.
It could also be cool if one were to make like play through Star Wars 1 to 6, play the whole Luke Skywalker era.
So that is, I know a lot of the guys that I've been interacting with. The Discord has about 150 people that are pretty active, and we all discuss random things. Most of them are doing their campaign settings in current era. So, like the one that I'm actually playing in is current era. I think it happens. The time frame is between episodes 3 and episodes 4. Our party is a party of 6 people, and only one of them can be a Jedi because there aren't a lot of Jedi left. But yeah, that's actually the more popular era, which, to each their own. I love the Old Republic, so I'm going to be sticking with that.
It's also the era of Luke Skywalker is the one that it's highly, what can I say, it's highly noticed in popular culture, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's, the movies are obviously the biggest part of Star Wars, and they all take place, in a 60-year span or whatever. Yeah.
There's not much. There are not many people that know like Knights of the Old Republic, because that was an old game.
Yeah, first one came out in 2001, I think. It's pretty old.
Yeah. So I think that's why people tend to orient themselves to something that's what can I say, something that's familiar and not that daunting to go into.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So I think that air quotes a module for like Knights of the Old Republic would be cool for people that don't know how to like play this era in the Star Wars universe.
It would be absolutely awesome. It's difficult to make a video game like that into a campaign, because I'm not going to spoil it, because you guys, if you haven't played through KOTOR and KOTOR 2, you really should. But the protagonists are very significant people, so you wouldn't want a player character to be the protagonist of that game, because he's like a very noteworthy individual.
So you mentioned you have like a Discord, and was it a subreddit?
Correct.
Don't hold back like saying them in here to get more people.
I mean, I imagine that a lot of the people that are listening to this are already aware, at least on my side, because I'll be telling all of my cohorts about it. So yeah, Reddit r-sw5e Star Wars 5th edition. Check it out, submit, subscribe, whatever you want to do.
Let's go a little bit back to the monster manual, because there's some sick artwork in it. Where did you find the artist to do that?
The most of the artwork comes from Wikipedia, which is like the go-to Star Wars wiki, and the artwork, a lot of it is from the books, like the Star Wars Encyclopedia and stuff like that. So as far as like getting artist consent for those, it's difficult because it doesn't list it a lot of the times. And then a lot of the artwork, comes from the same 2 or 3 people who were pretty prolific Star Wars artists, and so I've emailed all of them for consent. But I mean, I'm not monetizing it, so there's not. I don't think there's any issues.
No.
As far as
That's also one of the great things. This is totally free.
Yep, definitely free.
Yeah. You just need to find the Reddit link.
You just need to find it. Yeah.
If
you sub to r/SW5E, on the very top page there'll be a pin, and we'll have all of the content you need readily available with links that will automatically, will always be the most current content.
Have you been contacted by Disney yet?
Nope. Fingers crossed.
Yeah. It's like it's something that like is a bit in the back of one's mind that please don't contact.
Not Wizards either. So most of the content is in accordance with Wizards, like fan content policies, where as long as you're not paywalling it, it's fine. There is so predominantly the content that people release for 5e is just the gravy, not a lot of the potatoes. So it's like the class, the archetype, things like that. It's not the mechanical chapters. So this book is structured almost exactly like the traditional player's handbook, in that it has a chapter around combat, it has a chapter around adventuring, and those chapters are structured almost identically to their traditional 5e counterparts. So except reskinned, and adjusted to fit a Star Wars setting. And most people don't, re-release things like that. So
that's also one of the things that made it easy for me to get into, because, as I said before we started this podcast, I'm not like a huge Star Wars nerd, but I have seen the movies, so I'm familiar with the stories, but not the lore of the universe. So when you put it into the framework of D&D, it was very, very, very easy for me to see where you were taking this.
Good, that's what I want to hear.
But also, I have only been the GM role of a what do you call it? Of a Dungeons and Dragons game. So that's maybe why I am familiar with on how to approach it. I haven't been a player yet, because none of my players want to be a GM.
That's the nature of the DM, always the bridesmaid, never the bride.
Exactly. Have you played your Star Wars game as a player?
So I mean, I'm playing in that one shot. We've had it's a one shot, so it's not going to be a super long campaign. We're 2 sessions in so far, so I play a little bit. I'm playing a Chiss scholar tactician who needs some rebalancing. Which, sorry guys, if you're playing scholars, they're incredibly overpowered right now.
One thing that just popped into my mind is there like a huge interplanetary traveling or something?
So I actually have released. So we've mentioned 2 books so far. There's actually a 3rd book that I released a few weeks ago, and I actually released an update for it on Friday. It's called Starships of the Galaxy, and it's content. It's an optional rule set designed for people who want to have a spaceship and do space combat, and it has a lot of overlap with ground combat. It's got its own system of stat blocks. It's so far it's like 24 pages or whatever, but it has all the mechanics you need to add space to your campaigns. So that's a very important to some people, not to others, rule set. My group that I'm DMing to, nobody took piloting skills, so I don't imagine space combat and spaceships are going to be important to them.
Or it's going to be a very hard endeavor.
Or yeah, because none of them are proficient in piloting, so they're going to suck at it.
So they need to go out to some shady place and then hire Han Solo or something.
Yeah, and that's what I mentioned to them, is that if that's something they want to get involved in, they're going to have to hire somebody to be a pilot.
So do you have pod racing as well? What was that called? Those
Pod
horrors?
racing.
Yeah.
Yeah, you had it.
uh,
Yeah.
is that possible too?
I mean, you could. I have not written rules for that. Honestly, nobody has suggested it up until this exact second. It would be pretty easy to write up. You know, there's stat blocks for speeders. You could easily adjust those to pods. And mostly, it's less of something that I think needs a defined mechanical route, and it could just be a series of skill checks, contested.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's the way to do it.
Um, so yeah, it was a huge task. So you have made the handbook, you have made like the monster manual, and you have made that book for the space stuff. What was it
Yep,
called?
Starships of the Galaxy.
Starships of the Galaxy.
Yep.
Is there any more coming?
So right now what we're working on is, if you've seen the books, they're made using GM Binder, which if you've never used GM Binder, it's awesome. You should definitely use it. Mm-hmm. Right now, the skin of the books, like the fonts, the colors and everything, are in line with the original D&D books. We're actually working on a theme, or I should say I have a theme to make it way more Star Warsy. So right now my goal is to get that implemented across the books. And then what I'm going to do is trim down the content of the player handbook so it's more appealing to new players. So instead of, right now I think there's like 40 species, which is insane. I'm going to cut that back to 15 in the original book, and then I'm going to release all the other stuff in a fourth supplement, tentatively called Galophile's Guide to the Galaxy. We'll see how that pans out. But just so basically the goal is to release a player handbook, a final version of it for new players and new DMs to review, and then have optional content that people can add on, similar to like Xanathars and Mordekainen's and Skag and all these 5e expansion books.
So if one were to listen to the podcast and say, hey, I really want to join and maybe try playtesting your stuff, you need to go to your Discord, right?
If you want to actively discuss, and I'm on Discord and I'm on the subreddit like 12 plus hours a day, so I'm almost always available. If you want to actively discuss this stuff, especially with the group, your best bet is Discord 100%. Yeah, because we're all pretty active on there. That's where I go, when I introduce a new species or a new archetype, any of that stuff, all the peer review is done on the Discord. We did a massive overhaul of the Guardian class to make it way better, honestly. It seems way more fun and way more Jedi-like. We did that, that was done via Discord, so I would definitely recommend, if you actively want to participate in discussion and brewing, you should be on Discord.
So I can definitely say that I need to run a game set in this universe with your rules, because my wife is a huge Star Wars nerd, and she would definitely love this.
Yep.
I don't have any more today, Stephen. So if you have something you want to talk about on,
no, I think we pretty much hit it all. And Disney, if you're listening, don't sue me. But that's about it.
Exactly. No.
That's that. I think I covered everything. Yeah, that was cool. Thank you.
Great. So that was my talk with Stephen Kiel. If you want to support the podcast, please visit my Patreon at the Story Podcast.